We are excited to be partnering on this evening's talk with our friends at the Workers' History Museum. Tonight, we are pleased to be joined by Wilbray, Megan McLeod, President and Vice President of the Workers' History Museum. I first want to remind everyone to support our guests by keeping yourselves on mute throughout this evening's presentation. There will be plenty of time for questions afterwards, so we encourage you to type your great questions or comments into the chat box during Brian's talk, and we will read all your questions, and Brian will enthusiastically answer them to the best of his ability at the conclusion of his presentation. I'm sure Wilfred and Megan will be pleased to answer any questions you have as well. And so, without further ado, I will hand things off to Wilfred and Megan, who will give us a rundown on what the Workers' History Museum is all about, and then introduce tonight's esteemed guest speaker.
Okay.
Hey, Megan, you go first.
Yes, I will. I just have to get everything up and running. That's the one. Okay. I'm not used to not being able to see what I'm doing, so. Right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Megan, and I'm the fairly newly elected Vice President of the Workers' History Museum. First of all, many thanks to the HSO for inviting us to co-host this talk about the general strikes in 1919 and why they didn't really hit Ottawa. I say co-host, but in actuality, it's Dr. Brian McDougall's talk, and we're just here to listen and revel in the history of it all. But I'm going to take just a couple minutes to tell you a bit about the Workers' History Museum. This is my first event since I joined the executive, so bear with me as I try to sum up some highlights of the work the museum is doing, and in a way that won't eat into the main presentation's time. The Workers' History Museum was founded in 2011 to celebrate, interpret, and preserve the history and culture of working people, especially but not only in the National Capital Region. The museum has done this through creating traveling, permanent, and especially more recently, virtual exhibits, but also have an extensive physical collection of artifacts, especially photographs that help us better understand and illustrate working life in Ottawa and beyond. The picture here is one of the many, many, many little, I call them history stations, wraps that were where you can learn a bit about Ottawa history. You might notice the Workers' History logo at the very bottom of that. And there's a QR code on each one so you can find out more about each location. Right, back. We are almost entirely volunteer run, though we do hire students when funding allows. We do receive funding and other donations from a variety of sources, including the City of Ottawa, the Province of Ontario, but also from union support like the PSAC. Some projects we've worked on recently include helping with, our members helped with the research and editing of Bonnie Robichaud's memoir, It Should Be Easy to Fix, which was released this spring. It's about her decade-long legal battle after experiencing workplace sexual harassment while working for the Department of National Defense. Her tenacity, her hard work, and her networking with unions especially ultimately led to the Supreme Court of Canada setting a legal precedent that employers are responsible for maintaining a respectful and harassment-free workplace. It's available at all the best bookstores and also from the Ottawa Public Library. Our members have also participated in heritage walks and talks, and most recently our secretary and also visual or image archivist gave a presentation to the Ottawa branch of the Ottawa Genealogical Society about the tugboat, the Minnie Bell, and the Shaver family who owned it, obviously tying that into the history of the Rideau Canal and the local lumber industry. He also recently worked on a project documenting the former E.B. Eddy Domtar paper mills properties for the museum, and you can see some of those photos on our website. I'll put in a link in the chat later. As well, members, especially producer Art Carter on both of these, the museum has helped with documentary films that may be of interest, including What is a Family, which is about the legal struggle for equal benefits for same-sex couples in the Canadian public service, and Simply the Best, a film about the life of Cal Best, a major figure in Canadian Black history and one of the founders of the predecessor to the Public Service Alliance of Canada. These are on YouTube, and you can also find them on our website as well. I would be remiss if I did not mention that we have a fundraising event coming up. It's not a history talk, it's a trivia night at Colonnade Pizza on October 17th. Tickets are $15, so grab your smartest friends and head on over for some pizza and some trivia and some fun. Also, please visit our website at workershistorymuseum.ca to explore some of our other exhibits. My favorite, I think, is Britannia, the People's Playground, which is about the early 20th century amusement park at Britannia Beach, which was an easy, if very long ride on the trolley on a Sunday, which at the time was the only day of the week that everybody had off. Also, maybe consider becoming a museum member. We would love to have you. We're going to head back to the main event now, but first I'm going to pass the mic over to the Workers' History Museum President, Wilbray Truffaut, and thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And Ben, I just want to make you feel better, Ben. You're not the first one who got problem with my first name. So if the Guinness Book of Record was recording the people who got problem with my first name, I will be probably winning the record of the most mispronounced first name in the world. So let's go to the what I'm supposed to do. So the presentation of Brian. Well, I met Brian in 1977 at Ottawa U in a course about labor. And I quickly realized that when Brian was talking about labor, he knew his stuff, believe me. And also what I found out through the years was Brian was not only writing about labor history, but also be part of it. Just to give you a clue, he has been involved in the following union: QP at Carleton University, Association of Part-Time Professor at the University of Ottawa. He has been also involved in the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, which is a part of the Federal Public Service. He also served on the executive of each of the unions I just named, as a president, vice president, chief shop steward, and in addition have also, in addition, he has also been a delegate to the Ottawa District Labor Council and the Ontario Federation of Labor. And I will conclude with that following little story about Brian, and it will give you an idea of what you will get tonight. Many years ago, a friend of mine who was on a board for a PhD, he started to talk to me about a PhD thesis, the one of Brian, which was political sociology, and involved a comparative study of revolutionary crisis in Russia in 1917, in Chile, in Portugal, and in Poland. And my friend was telling me, said, you can tell what you read when you read the text that this guy is also a militant. So my little bird start to said, okay, I think I should know that guy. So I asked my friend, who wrote that thesis? Brian McDougall was the answer. So I said, well, I know the guy for 4 years, and you're right about him. So let's go to the presentation. Brian, it's your shot.
Yep. There we go.
Perfect.
Are we good to go?
We're good to go.
We are.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Will Bray, for those kind words. I remember fondly some of the debates we had back in the 1970s and many of the discussions and debates we've had over the decades since then. So I want to thank both the Historical Society of Ottawa and the Workers' History Museum for this opportunity to share some of the research I've been doing. I am working on a book on the history of protest in Ottawa, but the research that I'm doing is also driven by the fact that since I retired from the federal public service, I have been doing a series of radical historical walking tours in downtown Ottawa through my organization, People's History Walking Tours. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the material I'm talking about tonight, I actually conducted a tour about for the first time about 10 days ago with a group of federal public service trade unionists. So there are a lot of reasons why people study history. In my case, first and foremost, I'm a socialist, and I'm somebody who believes the world needs to undergo some pretty dramatic changes if the human species is going to survive into the next century. So while history doesn't present us with magic formulae that we can use to tell us what to do today as activists, it does help to sharpen our critical facilities, our ability to think through more clearly some of the obstacles and problems that we face as we try to change the world that we live in. In 1919, as I'll try to show tonight, there was a nationwide labor revolt all across Canada, and there was a series of general strikes. In most cases, those general strikes were initiated and led by socialists. Understanding the causes underlying that general strike activity and the processes by which people debated, discussed, and decided to go on general strike is, I think, critically important for those of us who want to change the world today. So this chart reminds us that in 1919, there were in fact 33 general strikes across Canada. The best known, of course, occurred in Winnipeg. But as you can see, there were general strikes in many other locations. 30 of those general strikes in columns B and C were sympathetic general strikes. That is to say, they were general strikes in solidarity with the general strike that was occurring in Winnipeg. If you look at column D, you see that Ottawa is identified as one of the major Canadian cities that did not have a general strike. And the question that I want to deal with tonight is why Ottawa did not have a general strike. Although, as we will see, there was a campaign for a general strike in this city. Now, when doing this kind of research and this kind of a talk, the first thing you do is you go and look at the material that's available. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see a partial stack of books that deal with the Winnipeg General Strike and related issues. On the left side of the screen, you see the one master's thesis done 30 years ago that talks about, and even then it doesn't focus exclusively or even primarily on the question of general strike, the possibility of a general strike in Ottawa, but it does touch on it. So obviously, I had to go back to other sources to begin to piece together the story of how the campaign for a general strike in Ottawa was defeated. So tonight, what I want to look at is what happened in Ottawa during 1919, why there wasn't a general strike, how the experience in this city compares with that in Winnipeg, and why we should be concerned about events that didn't happen, things that didn't happen. In this case, a general strike that never really developed. So the starting point has to be with a little bit of context. The period from 1914 to 1918, the period of World War I, dramatically synchronized economic and political developments around the world. Everywhere in Europe and North America and well beyond that, populations experienced military slaughter, attacks on civil liberties by their governments, repression, censorship, widespread campaigns of patriotism, scapegoating, racism. The World War began in a period of global economic slump, but it produced a raging economy in many countries with an economic boom and very high levels of inflation. Also very high levels of profiteering. All of that combined to bring about declining living standards and a massive growth of both trade unions and strikes as workers around the world sought to deal with the conditions that the war was creating. And we know, obviously, that in the aftermath, during the latter part of the war and in the aftermath of the war, there was a series of revolutions and uprisings. In this case, you see some photos from the 1917 Russian Revolution. But of course, there were a series of uprisings and revolutions elsewhere, including the one that occurred in Germany in November of 1918, which was the reason why World War I ended. It's not that the Allied powers won. It is that the German government was overthrown by its own population. And in the succeeding years, we would see other uprisings and revolutions in Hungary in 1919, in Austria in the same year, Italy, and so on. Too many revolutions for me to discuss in any sense tonight. But what's important about many of those processes is that what started as movements of political opposition to the regime, political revolutions, became, as they developed, social revolutions, attempts to replace the existing socio-economic order, capitalism, with socialism. And that experience during the period from 1917 through to the early 1920s gave rise to a new model of how to change society for those people who thought of themselves as socialists. Prior to the Russian Revolution, people believed that the way to transform capitalism into socialism was to elect a bunch of socialists to parliament, and then they would carry out a process of transforming society from the top down through changes in the state. What happened as a result of the Russian Revolution and these other events that I've mentioned is that a new model of revolution and social change emerged. And it centrally involved general strikes as a way in which the population would become mobilized, would create new political forms and institutions, workers' councils and councils of councils, or Soviets, which would then vie with the existing state for control over society, and if successful, result in an insurrection that knocked off the old government and replaced it with a new form of radical democratic workers' government controlled from the bottom up. So that was the new model that emerged during this period. As we'll see, that new model does not have any direct purchase, does not have any direct impact on the events that occurred in Canada in 1919. But it's vital to understand the context in which the Winnipeg General Strike and the Ottawa debate about a general strike occurred. And then just a final point before we get into Winnipeg, one of the really important Marxist socialists from this time was Rosa Luxemburg, who analyzed general strikes in great detail. And if you read her book, you'll see a series of distinctions and definitions and clarifications and illustrations of a number of different phenomena. So we understand a single strike is usually limited demands made by a group of workers towards one employer. Then you can have sympathy strikes, where other groups of workers go on strike to support the demands of a particular group of workers. But then, of course, you have the broader phenomenon that can affect an entire city, an entire region, an entire nation, which is a general strike, when all workers go on strike. And typically, as Luxemburg argued, those events very rapidly became political confrontations. And Luxemburg made a critical distinction that will be important for understanding what I'm going to discuss tonight. She distinguished between what she called demonstration general strikes and fighting general strikes. So a demonstration general strike was organized and controlled from the top down, had a very limited purpose, and was not permitted to become an occasion for the politicization of the struggle between workers and capital. By contrast, she argued, fighting general strikes come from the bottom up, they tend not to be centrally controlled, and they have a spontaneously revolutionary character. For Luxemburg, fighting general strikes were precisely the way in which workers would build the unity and solidarity that was required to continue the process all the way to a successful revolution. We'll come back to that point in a minute. So now let's get on to Winnipeg, because I want to talk a little bit about Winnipeg so that we can contrast it with the experience in Ottawa in 1919. So to start with, the Winnipeg General Strike started with strikes by building trades workers and metal council workers, people who worked in the rail yards and the contract steel shops. Started on May 1st and May 2nd. About 2 weeks later, the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council conducted a general strike vote with over 12,000 unionized workers voting. 93% voted in favor of a general strike to back the demands for wages, higher wages, and union recognition being made by the metal workers and the building trades. So that inaugurated a 6-week, 42-day strike, May 15th to June 25th. And that strike was organized through the Labor Council with 300 delegates from each individual union and a central strike committee of 15 that was responsible for making decisions on a day-to-day basis. During the period that the strike was on, there were many mass meetings. One historian has counted 170 of them in 6 weeks. And the biggest ones were held in Victoria Park, where crowds of up to 10,000 people attended and participated, listening to speakers and so on. However, during the general strike, there were no workplace occupations, and there was no creation of workers' councils, like the ones that we saw emerging in general strikes in some other countries, especially in Europe. What we do see in Winnipeg, however, is a profound polarization of the entire society. So on the side of business, businessmen organized themselves through something called the Citizens Committee of 1000. And then, of course, on the other side, you had the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council. The support for the Winnipeg General Strike went well beyond the organized labor movement. In fact, in addition to the 12,000 unionized workers who went on strike, 23,000, almost twice the number, of non-unionized workers joined the strike and participated in it. So in total, we're talking about 35,000 workers on strike. And when you consider their families and so on, that's easily half of the city's population in 1919. And critically, key elements of society beyond the organized labor movement were involved. So women workers were centrally involved. Telephone workers, workers in the retail sector, and so on. The substantial immigrant communities in Winnipeg were heavily involved, especially East European communities of Jews and Ukrainians, very important at large segments of the population, who were already pro-socialist well before the general strike began. And then finally, another element of society in Winnipeg that participated in the general strike were the recently demobilized veterans who had returned to the city after doing their service. And the estimates are that among the 10,000 veterans in the city at the time, about 3/4 of them actively supported the strike. So you get this sense that it's a very, very polarized situation. And inside the Labor Council, there were a number of political currents that we need to be a little bit familiar with, because we'll see the same sort of situation in Ottawa in a couple of minutes. Broadly speaking, the labor movement and the socialist, or the labor movement and the left, most broadly defined, had three general currents to it. One was the sort of mainstream advocates of business unionism, who believed that trade unions should either stay out of politics entirely and stick to negotiating contracts, or if they had to be involved in politics, they should make pragmatic deals with the mainstream political parties, liberals and conservatives. There was a second current. Today we would think of them as kind of NDP-ish, but most labor historians refer to them as laborists, advocates and supporters of independent labor politics, the creation of independent labor parties, who believe that by electing workers to a city, provincial, or national government, and winning a majority, it would be possible to essentially reform capitalism and make it a more humane system. And then the third current were Marxist socialists, who, as I suggested earlier, fundamentally believe that the electoral process could be used to elect socialists, and a socialist government could then bring about, from the top down, a process of change that would replace capitalism with socialism. Now, what's interesting about Winnipeg, and I don't have time to name all the folks who are portrayed on this slide, but they were all well-known figures. I'll say a little bit more about them later on. But what's important is that the Reds, the Marxist socialists in Winnipeg, members of political parties like the Socialist Party of Canada and the Social Democratic Party of Canada, were very well-known and very influential people with leading roles in trade unions, community-based organizations, and so on. So even though the Winnipeg General Strike was intended to have very limited objectives to achieve higher wages and better union recognition for a segment of the working class, and even though the labor leaders, including the Reds, the Marxist socialists, tried to restrict the general strike to simply a strike, we see during the course of the 6 weeks that it took place that it began to grow beyond those boundaries. It began to become politicized. It began to assume elements of what Luxemburg had called a fighting general strike. So even the most radical leaders of the general strike advocated a strategy of folded arms. Workers were to do nothing, just wait. They didn't even picket. They were just waiting for their employers to make the necessary concessions. But the logic of the situation politicized things, and slowly but surely, the strike leadership found themselves in a position where they began to have to make decisions that looked like they were political in character. So, for example, extending permission to the folks delivering bread and milk to operate at a time when a general strike was being conducted. And of course, the famous placard permitted by authority of the strike committee, which was put on the side of the wagons delivering bread and milk, is on the slide there. So even though there was an effort to restrict what the general strike was all about, it naturally began to politicize and began to expand beyond a demonstration general strike to becoming a fighting general strike and pointing towards the possibility of a new kind of political organization emerging from the ranks of the working class. So one more slide about Winnipeg, and then we will start talking about Ottawa. The general strike in Winnipeg was defeated, and we don't have time to talk about the details of it, but suffice it to say, 6 weeks in, first there was a police raid arresting 8 of the trade union leaders. A couple of days later, there was a famous confrontation between the special police and the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, attacking a major demonstration of veterans. 2 people were killed and 27 were wounded when the police started firing on the crowd. A couple of days later, the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council called off the Winnipeg General Strike. And a few days later, the police did another round of arrests, arresting 5 immigrant activists, thereby supporting what would become a major claim that the Winnipeg strike was initiated by enemy aliens, that is to say, East European radicals who had also been opponents of the war effort. So the defeat of the Winnipeg General Strike was a major defeat for the labor movement and the left in Canada. In its aftermath, there were trials, convictions, imprisonment, deportations. People were fired, they were blacklisted from their jobs, and there was some turmoil in the ranks of the socialist movement. So now let's talk a little bit about Ottawa. So the place I want to start is with just a little bit of a picture of what the labor movement looked like in Ottawa when the critical strike occurred in July of 1919. So Ottawa experienced pretty much the same kind of dynamics with respect to politics and economics that we see in other cities, including Winnipeg. That is to say, the raging inflation and the galloping economy, which reduced unemployment almost to zero, created the circumstances in which people began to join unions and go on strike in order to try to defend their interests. And we see there on that chart in 1919, the number of strikes that occurred, 16, and the number of workers who were on strike. And you can see that they're dramatic change from what had happened in previous years. The major groups in Ottawa's labor movement were the printers. They were the historic leadership of the labor movement in the city. The largest group were 3,000 building trades workers. And that's partly because, of course, the Parliament, the center block on Parliament Hill had burned down in 1916. And so there was a huge construction project underway that brought skilled building trades workers into the city. So they were fully 1/2 of the unionized population in Ottawa in 1919. And then another major contingent of the labor movement were about 570 workers at the Ottawa Electric Railway. And we will talk more about them in a few minutes. Historically, the labor movement in Ottawa had a very tight and close connection with the Dominion Trades and Labor Congress. So that was the national umbrella organization for the craft-dominated trade unions, organizations that were affiliated to the American Federation of Labor. And the Dominion Trades and Labor Congress had its headquarters in Ottawa. And just to give you a sense of how close the connection was, one of the founding members of the Labor Council in Ottawa was a man by the name of Patrick Draper. He was a printer, worked for the Government Printing Bureau. He was a founding member of the Labor Council in 1898, and starting in 1900, he became Secretary-Treasurer of the Dominion Trades and Labor Congress, so the national organization. He remained in the executive of the national organization for the next 40 years. And he also remained heavily involved in the local labor movement. So Ottawa's local labor movement was very tightly connected with the national movement. The key event in Ottawa is a strike that starts in July of 1919 among the drivers and conductors employed by the Ottawa Electric Railway system. And it was, of course, owned by two well-known and very wealthy and influential men, Thomas Ahern and Warren Soper. They were involved in a whole series of corporations in the city, owning the Ottawa Light, Heat, and Power Company, and the Ottawa Car Company, a company that was involved in the manufacture of street railway cars, in addition to owning the Ottawa Electric Railway system. And Ahern and Soper and the Ottawa Electric Railway, or OER, had a long history of being anti-union. In 1898, when the first union was formed, they fired the union leadership and the union fell apart. In 1903, a new union was formed and it would not stage a strike until 1918. And in 1918, there was a short 2-day strike over wages. Significantly, it followed a couple of months after management at the Ottawa Electric Railway had fired 2 union activists for being away from their vehicle for too long at the end of a run while they were having a pee break. And there was a threat of strike action by the workers, which resulted in their reinstatement. During the strike that we're going to focus on in a minute, in July of 1919, by the workers at OER, there was also a strike going on at the Ottawa Car Company, being waged by metal workers in the city, 200 metal workers, employed by 15 different companies, but by far the largest was the Ottawa Car Company, owned by Ahern and Soper. And they took a very hard line against the strike by Ottawa's metal workers. So now let's start talking a little bit about the context for the big strike that occurs in July of 1919. And I can't do justice to all the 16 strikes that were going on. I want to just give you a little bit of a flavor for the spirit of revolt that existed in Ottawa as the drivers and conductors went on strike in July. So when we look across this Ottawa society at this point in time, we see repeated examples of large groups of people assembling, taking collective action in pursuit of some kind of political or economic objective. There's already been reference to the very important battle against Regulation 17 and the quite amazing actions to occupy the Geeg Street School, but they were also accompanied by mass demonstrations that occurred on Parliament Hill. at one point 4,000 students, Franco-Ontarian students, were involved in a mass demonstration on Parliament Hill. There were mass anti-conscription demonstrations in Hull in 1917, and in 1918, we see the very first strike that occurred among federal public servants, other than letter carriers. They had a different history, but there was a sit-in strike by 10 women's stenographers in one department, which very quickly resulted in a victory for them. In 1919, the 3,000 building trades workers in May of 1919 went on strike, and within a week had won a major victory, achieving things that building trades workers around the rest of the country had not yet succeeded in gaining. But my favorite story from this period, to give you a sense of the spirit of revolt, actually has to do with students. Students, the boys in the St. Patrick's High School in May of 1919 conducted a strike to have a teacher who had been suspended by the school board reinstated. So these are young kids, teenagers, conducting a strike. And here are some of the tactics that they use, which give you some sense of what kinds of things are being discussed and used as people try to pursue their interests. So the students elected a strike committee. They organized pickets. They made cardboard on strike buttons. They denounced students who crossed their lines as scabs. They invaded other schools to get more students out. They pledged that if anybody was victimized, that they would all stay out on strike until the victimization was withdrawn. They sent a delegation to negotiate with the school board, and most interestingly, they inspired their teachers to go on strike. So within a few days of the student strike, their teachers went on strike and very quickly won wage improvements. So now let's talk about the main event, the strike of July 1919 by the conductors and drivers of the electric streetcars. So when you think about OC Transpo drivers today, they are members of a local 279 of the Amalgamated Transit Union. And that local 279 is a direct descendant of local 279 that existed in 1919. And so I will periodically refer to them as local 279. They went on strike July 1st in order to get a wage improvement. The inflation rate was running at 10% or more per year during the war years. And obviously that was compounding. So that pushed many workers to go on strike. The members of Local 279 voted on June 23rd in favor of strike action. Only 15 members of their local voted against strike action. So they were pretty much unanimous. And they made an important decision because once they announced their strike date, the government and the employer set up a conciliation process, which legally should have prevented the drivers and conductors from beginning their strike on July 1st until they went through an extended and complicated process of conciliation. In fact, the OER workers decided that they would stick to their strike date of July 1st, even though the conciliation process was not complete. And they did so for a number of reasons. First of all, the conciliation and legal process that the government had put into place many years beforehand was widely condemned in the labor movement as being something that favored employers and not workers. Secondly, the law was frequently violated without any ramifications. Thirdly, Hull Electric Railway workers had been on strike the year previously, And they had accepted conciliation. The conciliator that was appointed by the government gave them very little, and the government had selected the very same conciliator to preside over the dispute between the Ottawa Electric Railway and their workers. And then finally, during the strike in 1918, the very brief two-day strike that the OER workers had, management came out and announced that they planned to set up a scab operation. They were going to hire replacement workers and run their system without the workers who were on strike. And so in 1919, when the OER workers went out, they were fully conscious of the fact that management had a plan to run a scab service during their strike. So during the strike itself, workers typically met every day in the morning at one of these two locations. The building on the left is no longer, well, neither of these two buildings are standing any longer. The building on the left is St. Anne's Hall, and it was located right next to St. Anne's Church in Lower Town. And during the strike, that would serve as strike headquarters. But occasionally they would also have meetings at the building on the right, which was again in Lower Town. That building was known as the Monument National building. So those are the two locations that were central to the strike. Often during the morning, there would be reports from committees about how the strike was going. The Winnipeg General Strike had ended just 5 or 6 days before this strike began. And so interestingly, some of the speakers that were included in the early morning meetings were speakers from Winnipeg. So Fred Tipping, a former president of the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council, spoke to the strikers, as did Abraham Heaps, who was a socialist alderman in Winnipeg. And both of them urged the workers in Ottawa to support the cause of solidarity with the arrested and by then imprisoned strike leadership in Winnipeg. The strike also involved pickets at all the main locations of the Ottawa Electric Railway system. And there were 3 barns, places where the railway cars were kept. One on Coburg, one in Rockcliffe, and the main one was on Albert Street in the downtown area. And then, of course, another point of interest was the hydroelectric plant on Victoria Island that generated the electricity for the entire system. During the first week of the strike, things were relatively peaceful. Management was still involved in trying to organize its scab service, but it was not yet up and running. So the strike began on a Tuesday. On the Saturday night, there was a scuffle outside of the Albert Street barn, and a couple of strikers were arrested. But that was the only sort of major incident in the first week. Now, let me say just a little bit about the leadership of the OER workers. They were, among the unions, union locals in the city, they were led by lefties, pinks and reds, supporters of the Independent Labour Party and supporters of the Socialist parties. John McCaffrey was the president, William Jennings was the head of bargaining, and George Jardine was the picket captain. And they had, all 3 of them, been involved quite frequently in disputes and debates with more conservative union activists involved in the Labor Council in Ottawa. The leadership of the OER adopted a strategy for the strike which was very similar to that adopted in Winnipeg. They urged people, the workers, to fold their arms, keep the peace, and stay out as long as it would take, suggesting that a boycott of any scab service would likely be sufficient to win the strike. They made no effort to organize members of the public who supported the strike. They did not initiate a campaign for general strike action initially, and they had no answer to the fact that their international union used the excuse that the strike was illegal because it was initiated when the conciliation process had not been completed. The international union used that excuse as a way of denying strike pay to those who were out. So just as we talked a little bit about political currents in Winnipeg, so too we need to say a little bit about the political currents existing in the Labor Council here in Ottawa. And you can see I've organized photos according to some of the key leaders. So Peter Leckie and Frank Williams on the left were the best known Reds in the Labor Council. William McDougall and John Cameron in the middle were the best known sort of supporters of the Independent Labour Party process, kind of the pinks, the pink element in the Labor Council. And then on the right-hand side, you have the far more mainstream business unionists. And here we have a picture of William Lodge, the Secretary-Treasurer of the Labor Council, and Patty Draper, the guy I mentioned earlier on, who was one of the creators of the Labor Council and a longtime member of the executive of the National Labor Movement. So these were some of the principal characters involved in the local labor movement, involved in debating issues like general strike action and so on. And it's important to know that in both the months of May and June of 1919, so the 2 months preceding the big strike of the Ottawa Electric Railway workers, the issue of general strike action had come up in Ottawa's Labor Council. In May, there was an attempt to have a general strike discussion and vote in support of the strike by Ottawa's metal workers, which clearly was not going well. That motion to have a discussion about a strike vote, about a general strike vote, was defeated in the Labor Council. In June, the Vancouver Labor Council contacted Labor Councils all across the country, urging them to take sympathetic general strike action in solidarity with Winnipeg. When the correspondence came up in the Labor Council meeting in Ottawa in June, the executive urged the members to just ignore it, to pass it along to the National Union. The Reds tried to have the correspondence discussed and debated so that they could get a motion for general strike action on the floor. They were defeated yet again. So it's clear that there were efforts to raise the issue of a general strike in the Ottawa Labor Council, but they were going nowhere. Unlike Winnipeg, the balance of power between the political factions within the labor movement was very different. Instead of the Reds in the center being dominant, in Ottawa, it was the business unionists who were dominant. So what happened? Week 2 of the strike, things escalated dramatically. There were a series of mass meetings held in the evenings, one on July 5th, one on July 10th. There was a series of local parades initiated by the strikers on July 2nd, 3rd, and 10th. Also, on July 9th, so that's 9 days into the strike, the scab service was launched. And the first streetcars being run by strikebreakers had heavy police presence on them. So there were a couple of cops on each streetcar, and there were very few passengers. The strike-breaking operation was being organized in part by the Teal Detective Agency based in Montreal, an organization that was notorious because about more than a decade earlier, in 1906, they had been centrally involved in suppressing a strike in Buckingham with the assassination of two of the strike leaders. So they were well known in Ottawa. From the beginning, management insisted that they were not hiring replacement workers or scabs. They were hiring permanent replacements, and they would never waver from that position. So with day 9 and the beginning of a scab service, the balance of power between the employer and the workers began to shift. And on July 9th, July 10th, and July 11th, there were a series of quite impressive confrontations between large crowds of people and the scab-run streetcars. So the crowds we're talking about, I'll try to sort of short circuit this a little bit. The crowds we're talking about were up to 1,000 people. And they were pulling the trolley off of the electric wire. They were opening the air brake valves. They were throwing trash at the scabs, and so on. One evening, the local press described the activity outside the Albert Street barn that involved 2,500 people, including lots of women and children. The local press described it as the crowd laying siege to the Albert Street barn. There were, of course, many cops out and many cops out on horseback and so on. The city had decided to hire special police to supplement the regular police force and deal with the situation. So there was lots of evidence of significant public support for the strike in opposition to the Ottawa Electric Railway and its owners. And that's not surprising because Soper and Ahern, in addition to being renowned for being anti-union, were much disliked by the public because of the high prices that they imposed on people for the services that they provided. So at this point in time, the end of week 2 of the strike, things were getting quite polarized and becoming quite dramatic. There was lots of indication that there was a potential for the strike to escalate and to involve other groups of people, just as the strike did in Winnipeg. And that's what triggered a series of fateful meetings. On Saturday, July 12th, so now almost, well, we're 12 days into the strike, the executive of the Labor Council met with the Labor Minister in Ottawa and worked out a joint strategy whereby they would try to convince the striking workers to go back to work pending the outcome of the conciliation process, while at the same time trying to convince the OER management to accept all the workers back, because once OER started hiring scabs, they announced that they would not be, that the scabs would not lose their jobs in the future. In other words, scabs would eventually replace some or even all of the strikers. So that was the plan that the Labor Council executive and the Labor Minister came up with. When they put the plan to management at OER, the management said they were absolutely uninterested in taking workers back and laying off replacement workers, that they wanted to continue with the process as it was underway. So that left the labor leadership with a dilemma. On the one hand, they were concerned that the strike might continue and everybody might lose their jobs and be replaced by scabs, which would mean the end of the union, the loss of 570 union jobs, the loss of union dues. But on the other side, they were also concerned about all of the signs of a growing escalation in the city of public support for the strikers and growing demands for more militant action. And so that was when the Labor Council Executive came up with a new strategy, a modification to their initial strategy. They offered the strikers a carrot and a stick. The carrot was that on Monday, July 14th, they announced that they would hold an emergency general meeting of the Labor Council to discuss more aggressive action against the OER, with the implication that it might include a general strike. At the same time, they used their stick of the strikers not getting strike pay and of the technically illegal character of the strike. They used that to convince the strikers to vote in favor of a return to work to wait for the outcome of the conciliation report. So that strike vote went 516 in favor of a return to work and 16 opposed. So there was a carrot and a stick situation. Obviously, the possibility of much more militant, perhaps even general strike action, along with a concession to trying to please the minister with respect to the technical illegality of the strike. That trade-off was something that workers were prepared to do. So what happened? When the general strike meeting, or when the special Labor Council meeting happened on Tuesday, July 15th, there was a presentation by the strike leadership, and very quickly there was a vote on the motion which you see on your screen. So Peter Leckie of the Socialist Party of Canada made a motion in favor of general strike action. It was adopted unanimously. That is to say, all of the delegates who were there, including not only the Reds, but the supporters of the Independent Labour Party and even the business unionists, backed this resolution. The plan coming out of the meeting was that 2 days later, on the Thursday night, there would be a mass outdoor rally in Lower Town, and on the Friday night, the results of the strike votes taken in each union would be announced at the Labor Council meeting, and unionists in Ottawa would know whether or not a general strike was beginning. However, the campaign for a general strike, which had effectively begun with the passage of that motion, was very, very quickly preempted. The next day, the Minister of Labor, you can see him over on the left-hand side, Gideon Robertson, and the Labor Council Executive organized a meeting which involved the strike leadership and representatives from management. The meeting took place in the Department of Labor building, which you can see down on the right-hand corner. It's not, doesn't exist any longer. And at that meeting, once again, management insisted that by that point they had 135 SCAB employees. They insisted that they would not fire those SCAB employees and take back all the strikers. That if the strikers wanted to come back to work, they would have to be prepared to lose 135 jobs. So that was a resolution that was unacceptable to the strikers, but at the same time, management said that they issued essentially an ultimatum that they would give the strikers 48 hours to decide whether or not they would come back and lose 135 jobs, or everybody would lose their job. In the aftermath of that meeting on Wednesday morning, the Labor Council Executive announced that because there had been a face-to-face meeting between management and the strikers, there was no longer a need for any discussion about a general strike. And as a consequence, they called off the rally for Thursday night, and they called off the general strike vote or Friday. So within less than 24 hours of starting, the campaign for a general strike was ended. And the outcome was that the strikers very quickly found themselves sandwiched into a situation where they had very few options. They could either continue to strike on their own without any support or solidarity from the rest of the labor movement, with a possibility that they might lose the strike, or they could accept the loss of 135 positions and go back to work on those terms, effectively a victory for management. And by Friday, July 18th, they had made their decision, and unfortunately, we don't know the exact outcome of the vote. It wasn't reported, but they decided at that point to concede defeat and go back to work. Now, in the aftermath of the strike, we see a fairly serious decline in militancy and offensive strikes by workers in Ottawa, just as with the aftermath of the Winnipeg General Strike. In the second half of 1919 and into 1920, worker strikes all across the country are shifting from being offensive campaigns for better wages and better working conditions, and shifting over towards becoming defensive battles to try to defend themselves against the inroads of management. In the aftermath of the defeat of the OER strike and the failure to mount a general strike, the Reds and Pinks in the leadership of Local 279 resigned. The Labor Council held elections in August of 1919. All of the Reds were prevented from capturing any position. And in the succeeding years, socialists in the city would start to debate the wisdom of the strategies that had been used not only in Ottawa, but also in Winnipeg in 1919. So why was there no general strike in Ottawa when there was one in Winnipeg and one in 32 other places? Well, I think we can identify three types of reasons. One is that there were quite serious differences in the economic, political, and demographic nature of a place like Winnipeg and a place like Ottawa. Secondly, there were very different experiences of class struggle and militancy and strike action between the two cities. And then thirdly, I think we can also point to the very different levels of credibility and experience that the Reds, the Marxist socialists, had in both cities. So let me explain what I mean. If we look at the employment structure in the city of Ottawa and compare it with that of Winnipeg, we see some pretty obvious things. The public sector was really, really big in Ottawa. It was not big in Winnipeg. By contrast, the manufacturing, the iron and steel, the trade and merchandise, and the transportation sectors were very large in Winnipeg. Now, significantly, the segment of the union movement that led the militancy and that dominated socialist organization in Winnipeg were the metal workers. Very, very large number of metal workers, very highly organized, very highly politicized. Ottawa did not really have a counterpart. The largest segment of the workforce in Ottawa were the public servants, who were non-union at this point in time. And so that kind of illustrates some of the dramatic differences between the two cities, and helps to begin to explain why there was a different outcome to the campaigns over general strike action. Similarly, if we look at the ethnic composition of the two cities, we see that, and again, no big surprise, the French Canadian population in Ottawa and Ottawa Hull was very substantial, very significant by comparison with Winnipeg. On the other hand, the East European population in Winnipeg was very substantial by comparison with that in Ottawa. If we talk about the Franco-Ontarian population, the Francophone population, both in Ottawa and in Hull, they tended to be, for a whole variety of reasons, outside of the mainstream labor movement, far more conservative, far more influenced by Catholicism and nationalist ideas, and not part of the central dynamic that was taking place in the Ottawa labor movement. By contrast, when we look at the East European community in Winnipeg, very large Jewish and Ukrainian communities, and as I said earlier, they were predominantly socialist in character, very heavy supporters of the General Strike movement and of the action in 1919. So we've already talked a little bit about the important events in the battle against the Regulation 17 that shaped the experience of the French-Canadian community in Ottawa. And significantly, when you look through the press for statements by Ottawa's Labor Council and labor movement in support of the defense of French language education rights, you find nothing. That is to say, Ottawa's labor movement was not involved in this very important struggle. Similarly, Ottawa's labor movement was only peripherally involved in the very substantial anti-conscription movements that existed in Hull and in Lower Town during the war years. If we look at the situation of women, we see a really big difference between the way in which women were organized politically in Winnipeg and Ottawa. Both cities had growing numbers of women involved in the workforce. That was partly the influence of the growing economy during wartime. But we also begin to see women getting involved in the labor movement, albeit they're still fairly marginal. In Winnipeg, there was a middle-class women's movement preoccupied with issues of suffrage and so on. They tended to be pro-war, anti-immigrant, and not necessarily supportive of the trade union movement. But we also see in Winnipeg the emergence of a working-class women's movement. The Women's Labor League, for example, played a very significant role in the Winnipeg General Strike, organizing single women who were workers, holding special meetings for women, organizing direct actions, and even organizing women at the community level to attack any scab vehicles that were about in the city during the Winnipeg General Strike. When we look at the situation in Ottawa, we see no counterpart to the Women's Labor League. There just was no left or socialist organization that was involved in organizing working women or women at large in the city of Ottawa. So here the purpose of this table is simply to document the number of times that general strikes were debated and discussed and voted upon in the two cities. And when you go through the accounts, what you see is during the period of 1918 and 1919, the topic of general strike is discussed repeatedly and voted on repeatedly in Winnipeg. With at one point in May of 1918, almost 2/3 of the organized labor movement in Winnipeg beginning to go out on strike in support of municipal workers who were being attacked by their management. So you had actually a kind of a practical experience, a dress rehearsal in something very much like a general strike. When you look at the situation and the experience in Ottawa, you see that there was, by contrast, no comparable experience of kind of general strike activity, very few discussions of the idea, and no votes about general strike action prior to the one that happened in July of 1919. So there's a very different experience with the phenomenon of general strikes in the two cities leading up to the critical events, the Winnipeg General Strike and the campaign for a general strike in Ottawa. And then finally, with respect to the role of the radicals, the Reds in both Winnipeg and Ottawa, if you go through all of the kinds of organizations that they're involved in, the initiatives and so on, what you see is that there is a very large milieu of Red socialist activists in Winnipeg who have a great deal of experience, a lot of influence. They're extremely well rooted. They're very well known. They're trusted. They're viewed as credible, and they're viewed as an alternative leadership to the more conservative elements in the labor movement. By contrast, when you look at the situation of the Reds in Ottawa, they are kind of the mirror image. There are few of them. They're not well rooted. They're not well known. They have not managed to build organizations outside of tiny political parties and so on. And so that is also a critical part of the explanation for why the campaign for a general strike in Ottawa was short-circuited so rapidly. So just to wrap up, what happened in Ottawa in 1919? Well, there was, if no general strike, there certainly was a labor revolt taking place. And the radicals in the Labor Council initially won the motion in favor of moving towards a general strike, but then were very quickly outmaneuvered by the more conservative business unionist leadership of the Labor Council, who essentially negotiated and presided over a process by which the OER strike would end in a defeat. So how does the experience in Ottawa compare with that in Winnipeg? Well, I think the critical thing is that in Winnipeg, the Reds were able to win not just the critical campaign for a general strike in May of 1919, they were able to win the campaign for general strike action on several previous occasions. By contrast, in Ottawa, the Reds were not able to win the campaign. And that's the critical difference. What's the long-term significance of the defeat of the 1919 campaign in Ottawa? Well, many of the same kinds of issues and obstacles that faced the socialist activists in Ottawa in 1919 are still in place. That is to say, today's Labor Council is still very heavily influenced now by the National Office of the Canadian Labour Congress. But it's also influenced by the national headquarters of various other organizations in Ottawa, the NGOs and so on, and their politics tend to be a lot more conservative than the politics required to organize a general strike. Secondly, the public service today is unionized, unlike 1919, but the legislation that it is unionized under makes those unions far more conservative and internally divided in nature. And so as a consequence, the federal public service is still a bit of an obstacle to the possibility of this kind of militant general strike action in the city of Ottawa. The English-French divide that we saw in 1919 still has its counterparts in Ottawa and in Ottawa-Gatineau today. So if we think about some of the more recent campaigns by Franco-Ontarians to defend their rights, for example, under the Mike Harris government in the 1990s, the campaign to keep the Montfort Hospital open, there was very little involvement by English language and Ottawa-based trade unions in that kind of a campaign. And then finally, the labor movement is still in this city largely detached from some critical segments of the broader working class, such as precarious workers, immigrant and racialized workers, non-union workers, and so on. And they tend to not be involved in some of the critical political issues that come up. For example, the ongoing campaign to deal with the colonial reality that Indigenous people face, and the ongoing campaigns against climate change. So what I would suggest is that understanding what happened in 1919 is critically important to understanding some of the other episodes that developed in Canadian history around general strikes. And I don't have time to talk about them, but 1972, there was a common front strike in Quebec. It started as a demonstration general strike and then eventually moved towards becoming a fighting general strike. In 1976, there was a one-day national political general strike against wage controls. That was a demonstration general strike organized by the Canadian Labour Congress. In 1983 in BC, there was a movement towards a general strike. In 1996 to 98 in Ontario, in opposition to the Harris government, again, there was a movement towards general strike action. So general strikes are still a phenomenon that come up in our world. There's still a way in which people try to organize themselves to press their interests on their employers and or the state. And in that respect, I think they remain critically important phenomena. And if we look over the course of the 20th century, since 1919, we see several periods in which there have been recurring uprisings and general strikes, some of which triggered situations where the general strike grew over into a situation of dual power, the existing state and a potential workers' government, with the two of them vying for control over society at large. But there is still a lot to be discussed and learned about the phenomena of general strikes. These two books that I've put the covers on this slide are recent publications discussing the implications of general strike action for our world today. On the right, the Revolutionary Rehearsals book looks at recent experiences of uprisings and asks the question why some of the phenomena that we saw emerging during revolutionary uprisings after World War I are not recurring these days. Why general strikes are not leading to situations of dual power where you have workers' councils on the one side and the existing state on the other hand. The other book is a very recent science fiction novel, which looks at the world in 50 years from now and talks about how and why the economic system and the climate crisis produced revolutions and fundamentally transformed the world. And in its discussion and portrayal of massive social change, it excludes some of the kinds of phenomena that are usually associated with discussions about general strikes and revolutions and so on. Be that as it may, and this is my conclusion, regardless of what we think about how the world can and should be changed, the experience of campaigning for large-scale collective action and debating that option and organizing that option is one that was important in 1919. It remains important today. And so for people like myself, socialists, and people who believe that we need dramatic change very quickly if we're going to deal with the possibility of the disappearance of the human race, the discussion about why some campaigns for general strikes succeeded and why others failed remains a critically important question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian, for a very illuminating talk, and obviously thoroughly researched as well. Some great information in there, and certainly, you know, a flip side of some of the history that we used to sharing with the Historical Society of Ottawa. As is quite typical, the questions are just starting to flow in. So I will start off asking some of these questions, and I might even interject some questions of my own. But I do urge all of our participants tonight to put your thinking caps on. You've listened to Brian's presentation, and let's come up with some great questions. Maybe we can stump them on something. And as well, you're welcome to ask questions about to Will Bray and Megan about the Workers' History Museum. And first of all, I do want to apologize to Will Bray Tifo for mangling your name. When your name is Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, you get every pronunciation possible. So I do apologize for that. I will actually blame it on spell check, because I made my notes on Word and I was reading off of spell check, and that's where it changed a little bit. So one question we have, Brian, is to what extent was the Winnipeg strike influenced by the returned soldiers? Is there any data on that?
Yes, it was heavily influenced in the sense that there was a group of, the estimates are about 10,000 returned soldiers in Winnipeg during the general strike. And as I mentioned in passing, about 2/3 to 3/4 of them backed the strike, but they did so in a way that was disruptive to the general strike leadership. So the general strike leadership, the leadership of the Winnipeg Labor Council, wanted to control everything to the point where they didn't even want people to picket for fear that it might provoke violence from the government and the police. So they were trying to keep everything under wraps. The veterans organized a number of marches around town to lobby the provincial government to settle the strike in favor of the strikers and so on. And in that sense, the veterans were outside of the control of the general strike leadership. So significantly, it was a veterans initiative, a protest that triggered the response by the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and the government and the specials, and resulted in Bloody Saturday, when the cops attacked the crowd of veterans and really began the process of crushing the strike in earnest. It also has to be said that the veterans were very mixed. So 2/3 supported the strike, 1/3 were opposed to the strike. And even through the ranks of the 2/3 supporting the strike, there was a lot of debate and a lot of questions about whether or not Eastern European immigrants who held jobs should be forced to leave those jobs so that veterans could be re-employed. So there was a whole dynamic of racism that ran through the veterans movement at large, regardless of what position they took on the issue of the strike. So understanding the veterans is a critical kind of element. I can say just in passing, I didn't talk about this at all, but during the big battles, the big debates over conscription in 1917 and 1918, the veterans in Ottawa played a really nasty role. So in May of 1917, when there were big demonstrations in Central Hull against conscription, demonstrations of 4,000 people, those demonstrations were rumored to be marching into Ottawa to make the point to the national government. And at one point, there was a crowd of in excess of 2,000 patriots and veterans and opponents of the anti-conscription movement that gathered downtown near the corner of Bank and Queen Street. And at one point, they were armed with cudgels and stuff. They were all set to provoke a major riot. if the demonstration from Hull came across the river. And in fact, at one point, about 700 to 800 of them set off to march into Hull to confront the anti-conscription movement. And thankfully, there was a retired Army officer who blocked their way with his vehicle, stood up on it, and managed to convince them all to go back to Ottawa, thereby circumventing what would have been a pretty significant riot over the issue of conscription.
Brian, you were talking about how there's ethnic cultural differences between the two cities that would have had an impact. One of our audience members is asking if you can elaborate on the French-English divide, why that would have made a difference.
Well, of course, part of my previous answer dealing with the conscription issue speaks to that. But when you read through the accounts of this period, it's very clear that there is a process of radicalization going on among Franco-Ontarians and among the Francophone population in Hull, but it is a radicalization that is connected with issues like conscription and Regulation 17 and so on. And the labor movement and the left in Ottawa had virtually nothing to say to people who were radicalizing around the issue of conscription and Regulation 17. They made no serious efforts to be involved in that. By contrast, if we think about the large East European population in Winnipeg, just prior to World War I, as I said, there was a major international recession, 1913 to 1915. And that produced mass unemployed movements in Canadian cities, including in Ottawa. But I want to talk for a minute about the mass unemployed movement in Winnipeg. It was organized primarily by socialists, members of the Socialist Party of Canada and the Social Democratic Party of Canada, that were deeply rooted in the Ukrainian and Jewish populations. So in 1915, for example, they had a major protest of 15,000 predominantly Eastern European unemployed workers and community members around the issue of unemployment. And this is the key point, the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council endorsed that action and sent people to speak at their rally in support of the initiative that was underway. There was no such initiative, no comparable initiative by Ottawa's Labor Council with respect to the militant actions undertaken by Franco-Ontarians or Francophone residents of Hull.
I guess it's a matter of making your tent big enough to include everybody who might be a potential ally and anybody who might need your help. We have another follow-up question to what you're talking about the returning soldiers. And that's a question, so when the 1919 strikes came along, were the veterans involved in those strikes or in the decisions around those strikes?
So yes, they were. I'm unaware of any attempt to pull together the experience of veteran activity and support of general strike activity across the country in 1919. So I know a little bit about what happened in Winnipeg. I know a bit about what happened in Toronto, but I'm not aware of anybody who's tried to compile a systematic examination of the role of veterans in all of the 33 general strikes. But what I can say about Winnipeg is that within the veterans organization, there was a very sharp debate over what position to take on the strike. And as I said earlier, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the veterans backed the strike. And so very quickly, a socialist who was also a veteran, a guy by the name of Roger Bray, became the leading figure in the pro-strike veterans movement. And he would play a significant enough role so that when the government decided to arrest people and crush the strike, in the initial round of arrests of 8 strike leaders, Roger Bray was one of the people arrested. So the exact nature of his ongoing and day-to-day connection with other strike leaders, I'm not aware that anybody has documented that, but clearly he and some other people around him were very closely connected with the way the strike was being conducted, though not sufficiently that they were prepared to adhere to the general strategy of the strike leadership, which included a prohibition on mass demonstrations. So the veterans were always a bit of a wild card.
So Brian, at this point, there are no more questions that have been typed into the chat box. So what I'll do at this point, if anybody else has any comments or questions, I'll invite you to unmute yourself at this point, and you can make your comments or questions to Brian.
May I?
Absolutely.
Okay, Brian, I just want to comment on what you said about Germany and the revolution there. It's pretty important to know that when revolution happened in Germany, Germany already lost the war. They are, in the Western Front, they are losing ground every day. At the end of October and beginning of November, their 3 allies, Bulgaria, Turkey, and the Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, signed armistice. And it's very important to know that is German High Command who requests the armistice first. Ludendorff explained it's over, it's finished. But they create that legend after the First World War, the backstab. They said that the revolution backstabbed us, which is totally false, as General Groner wrote. I won't read the text of Groner because it's too long, but Groner explained the one who are responsible for the loss of the war. This is not the German people. That's the officer who lost it. So if ever you wrote a text, precise that point, because
I take your point, but at the same time, you cannot understand Germany's loss in World War I without examining the rising tide of labor militancy.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And what triggers the revolution in Germany is the command by the naval officers to send ships out of the port of Kiel into a suicide attack on the British Navy. And that results in the German sailors seizing control of their ships, setting up a sailors' council, and creating a workers' council, which then spreads throughout the country and begins the revolution. So I take your point. Germany was losing the war for quite a considerable period of time prior to November 11th.
Yeah.
But
and the reason why the sailor revolt is because they knew it. They were losing, and they want to get killed, as you said, in a suicidal mission.
Yep.
Okay, anybody else?
I don't think we're opposed to each other.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any more questions or comments this evening? Brian, can you go back a slide to where you listed your websites, etc.?
Sure. Oops.
Yeah, I just want to point that out to everybody. Again, Brian offers some great tours through the People's History walking tours, and there's the website to access that as well. And I see you also have some TripAdvisor reviews. I would like to read some comments that some of our audience members have left this evening, including thank you for your talk tonight. It was informative and well researched. Thank you so much, Brian, and to the HSO and Workers' History Museum for this wonderful presentation. Terrific talk about largely unknown history. And that's key because, you know, so often we talk about many of the, much of the Ottawa history that's well known to everybody. And tonight you brought us an interesting perspective on an important part of our history. So I want to thank you very much, Brian, for joining us tonight. And I would like to invite our audience members to come back in October, either to the auditorium for our in-person presentation or at the end of the month for our next Zoom presentation. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight and have a great evening.
And Ben, can I just interject? I also want to thank everybody for participating tonight. And of course, I want to thank the people who posed some questions. And I'm happy to entertain additional questions. So there is a way that you can contact me via my website. If you want to learn more, you want to answer questions that didn't come up tonight, I'm happy to correspond with people in the future. And thank you also both to the Workers' History Museum and the Historical Society of Ottawa for organizing the event tonight.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.